I'm David McCree. I am the Director of Emergency Preparedness for the Transmission Department here at Duke Energy. Been with the company for, wow, 31 going on 32 years now. Been over in system operations for most of my career. And 3 years ago, I took on this challenge as we began to look at what does transmission need to do as far as being prepared for events. And at that time, 3 years ago, Nikki, it was all around storms and then also looking forward to other things like cyber attack. Believe it or not, even though we had pandemic plans, we really hadn't thought a whole lot about it and the impacts from that. Needless to say, 2020 has changed that.
My name is Jessica Hendrickson, and I'm the Transmission Construction Manager here in Florida for Duke Energy.
And my name is Troy Bias, and I am the Manager of Work Management here in Florida.
Sure, I'm Thomas Jackson, employed with Duke Energy. I work in the transmission department, and I actually work in asset management, and I provide technical support for power transformer equipment. I support our internal field apparatus crews, contractors, pretty much anybody that has a need or transformer support issue. I'm the man. I'm the go-to guy.
Brad Ricker, Substation Maintenance Supervisor, Carolinas East.
What was the biggest impact to you in the workplace when the pandemic hit, and do you find your job more difficult to perform now? If yes, how?
So for my job, it was all about getting us ready, making sure that our storm rolls, our teams were ready. We were implementing new software, and then when 2020 and then March timeframe hit, all that focus, all that effort was going to suddenly changed. So now my job was around how to engage the transmission business unit and react to this pandemic, react to say, what do we need to do because storm season is coming? We still had, the Easter storms in the Carolina. What does all that mean? So is my job more difficult to do? No, the focus has changed. And also in everything that we look at from doing drills or responding to these events, how has that changed for the company? We also had to engage in our logistics suppliers, the base camps. We had to tie more closely with customer delivery. And unfortunately, as we all have, we weren't experiencing that face-to-face interaction like we had been used to, where we would gather up and talk about, oh, what does it look like moving forward for the storm season? We couldn't do that anymore. We all knew that it was teams. We also began to look at, hey, how do we get our storm rooms together? That made it more of a challenge. So overall, is it a, more difficult, or what was the biggest impact? That loss of face-to-face, just probably like everybody's heard, that was probably the largest impact for this position.
So for me, the biggest impact was understanding as much as possible about the disease and how the virus was transmitted. That way, mitigating the hazards and putting some controls in place that actually work could be implemented quickly. And then as a result of that, in order to minimize exposure, obtaining the proper PPE, which for our crews is primarily masks and sanitizer, and making these available for the essential workers in the field. So making sure those limited supplies early on were really secured for the crews, for the boots on the ground and the essential workers in the field. In addition to that, it caused us to be more mindful of social distancing and mindful of having hand washing stations and essential hygiene measures put in place for the field workers, especially early on when there was shutdowns and there were many businesses that were impacted. So we really had to become self-sufficient in order to mitigate any hazards associated with the pandemic early on.
To play off of what Jessica just said there too, I think, the one thing that I saw have impacts on us right away was we were in a lot more meetings, be it Teams meetings or calls or whatever. Your day quickly got scheduled and doubled and triple booked. So it was hard to find time on schedules to even with folks now that you couldn't see them face to face like we had in the past. And with that as a leader, it made it extremely difficult to spend time with your folks in a lot of cases, because your days were booked in all these meetings to keep everything moving now that we weren't face to face.
The biggest initial impact was, of course, our directive to work strictly remotely with no visits to the offices or op centers allowed, unless it was some system support emergency. And even then, if such an emergency did arise where you were required to log your time in and out of which buildings you were in, the exact location inside those buildings, there's a lot of extra effort required if you did have to make an emergency office visit. So not being able to attend the offices on a regular basis presented issues with folks like myself that need equipment specific information, file information, test result information, things that are kept on file and not necessarily electronically available. So that was a stumbling block or hurdle to try to get over. And then as far as being on job sites, we have our new COVID protocol requirements for social distancing, face coverings, documentation when you bring contractors in, questionnaires, and just more documentation and effort around recording what was going on, who was there, and more effort needed to combat the COVID, the effects of the COVID pandemic. And then one other thing I wanted to mention, I know in some cases, some folks I've spoke with, since we are required to work remotely from home, some folks have mentioned that they found themselves ended up working a lot longer hours because with their home offices set up, it was just very convenient, I guess, to continuously work well past your normal quitting time. So it seems some folks found themselves actually logging in more time each day than they would have normally in their office environment.
My answer is going to be yes. I think our biggest impact was one of the directives we put in place to minimize exposure was to start job site reporting. So instead of the guys reporting to our office in the morning, we would try to be a little more strategic as far as planning work and designating certain employees to report directly to the job site. One of the things that comes with the territory of transmission maintenance is work directives, safety alerts, and just a lot of information on a weekly basis that over the last few years, I've had the privilege of having my employees with me pretty much every morning, and then we were able to share that information. But the job site reporting and the social distancing definitely impacted that. We got the information out, but it took a lot more effort to get that needed information to my employees.
Are there any pros or positives you found during this period and changes to the workplace?
So from a positive standpoint, I think overall our ability to respond to storms during this, that was a positive. We could still meet our customers' needs. We could still get the power back on, respond to these events while still being safe and protecting our employees. There was a lot of questions going into this. There was a lot of concern. What was going to happen when these events occurred that we are so used to doing? How would we respond? What would be the challenges? And to be honest with you, the pros are the people out in the field. They have done an amazing job. They did what they needed to do. They were safe. And that to me has probably been one of the biggest pros during this period to prove to ourselves. We also were able to leverage technology with the teams and the storm sites. So we didn't need to all be in a room together during these events. We found out, hey, we can do this through either sharing of files, on constant phone calls. We could actually do that because as we think about it, what was going to happen if this had been, people talk about cyber attacks and things like that, where we don't have that ability to communicate, telecom, what would we need to do? All that gave us a sort of a kind of a look into what that would be moving forward. So from a pros, we know we can do this. we were concerned, but we showed that, hey, we were able to definitely respond the way we needed to here at Duke Energy to ensure our customers receive power.
So Nikki, I can think of three pros that I found during this period with changes to the workplace. The first one is having, our CEO is a female. So the feminine style of leadership, there's some values and traits that really stood out during this time of crisis for us. And one of those was the frequent communication that she shared with all employees. Very, clear, honest communication, maintaining some decisiveness, but yet exposing some vulnerability because, we may not have gotten it right the first time, but we continue to try. And just having that, frequent communication. The other trait that I noticed that was very beneficial is the inclusive decision making, but yet being very agile in those decision making processes. And then I think another strong feminine trait in the leadership style was a higher sensitivity to risk related to health issues, and then the empathy and humility that were exhibited in the messaging. The second item that I identified that I found to really be a pro was quick implementation of a flexible sick leave plan for employees to have dependent care for those impacted by it or for themselves. And for us, I think our HR department did a fantastic job quickly implementing some type of a flexible sick leave plan. And then the third, which is probably one of the most obvious ones, is the recognizing the threats in the workplace, especially for open plan offices, and having to find smarter and safer ways to continue for our employees to work together. So as a result of that, we connected through video, thank goodness for Teams. And one of the biggest benefits with that is the time saved, eliminating all the travel for face-to-face meetings. And I think what we discovered through that is that we can accomplish tasks remotely without missing a beat in the productivity or the quality of our work. We still completed our capital work plan. We still tracked project updates, tracked schedules, tracked cost. Materials continued to get delivered, and we functioned, as a high-performing team across all of our, business units in transmission. So those were the three pros that I think were pretty significant through this, and they're positive pros. They're very positive.
So again, I completely agree with Jessica, especially on this last point. Prior to this pandemic, Skype was our tool to communicate if you weren't doing face-to-face. And I would say for the majority of us, we didn't even turn on the video. No one wanted to do video conferencing. It was maybe, it was talking. But with Teams rolling out right at that same time and being fully implemented, and then to where we are today, where we're recording podcasts on it and such, and you can see your folks face to face. It really has helped us to not skip a beat in a lot of cases and keep us moving in that right direction. And I go back to, it's helped us to be more efficient with our time, and we're not spending as much time traveling. Obviously, we're not traveling right now a lot anyway, but even the driving, across the state can now easily be handled more efficiently from a timing perspective with Teams meetings. Nothing of the hazard of driving itself being reduced.
Well, the only pro that came to mind when I read that question originally was with not having to report to your office location. It's been a positive for folks due to lack of travel and the expense and the cost of traveling back and forth and fighting traffic and safety concerns of being out there in the traffic. That's being able to work from home certainly has had its conveniences, in spite of the fact that it's caused a lot of folks to work excessive hours. So I guess that's a positive, the lack of travel and the convenience of just having things close by to your home for your work.
I'll say one of the few pros to this new approach to how we do our daily business was we were pretty much obligated to embrace new technology, new ways of getting that information I spoke to before communicated effectively to my employees. We all had to learn how to use different avenues of communication like Teams meetings. For several weeks now, I've had a Monday conference call. Instead of meeting those guys face to face, they've been calling into a conference line. So I guess the biggest thing is I've had a lot of employees that are fairly new, and other than dialing in the quarterly management updates and things of that nature, they're very limited exposure to that type of technology. So that is one benefit to how we've been able to do business the last few months.
How have we had to change how we respond to emergencies and storms with the pandemic?
I think a lot of it does come around with what the personal protective equipment we had to deal with, being safe with one another, evaluating that, the lead times of making sure that, hey, there's a storm out in the Gulf. What do we need to do down in Florida? I think a lot more prep was done, a lot more talk was done, a lot more, we're used to doing this, we're used to doing it. Oh, wait, it's changed. The team down in Florida was ready to go. The team in the Carolinas ready to go. We had those storms out in the Midwest, and then Carolinas West come through, those heavy windstorms, thunderstorms. I think a lot more attention was put on that from the standpoint of being ready sooner than what we are normally used to. And the team did an amazing job getting ready for that. As far as from our pandemic response, we had to look at what does it mean if we were ever needed to use sequestration? How do we work with the corporate on that? Working with corporate to make sure our supplies are ready to go, the PPE, the hand sanitizer, all of that. That had to change. We had to change how we would request that, where we had those shortages. What did we need to do to make sure that was done? And, the company, of course, responded by providing their own sanitizer, their own cleaning supplies, and working through that with supply chain, making sure that our crews had those ready to go. Overall, we've just had to be more prepared sooner than later than what we've done in the past. Not that we were never not prepared. It's just, hey, we need to be thinking about this, and everybody did that. Everybody was ready to go.
Okay. Well, two big changes on how we respond to emergencies and storms. And here in Florida, we have hurricane. We had our hurricane season and had to basically create from scratch how we were going to run our incident command system. And so essentially we had to become a high functioning virtual team managing that incident command system. And relied heavily on Teams. The second piece was really the mindfulness that needed to be centered on congregating large groups. Historically, we would find mustering areas, large sites, and that housed a large amount of personnel, human resources. And so with that, looking at the approach of really, where our resources were located geographically, and responding with them in their current place. So those were the two big shifts that we've really had to change with how we were responding to emergencies and storms. And then also looking at what our hierarchy of controls that we have in place, and the two big ones for mitigating hazards right now that we have with this virus is PPE and administrative. So really looking at what we had with that to be able to continue to respond to the emergencies and the storms, keeping employees with minimal exposure and reduced exposure so that we can continue to operate with the maximum amount of people that we had available to respond.
Yeah, prior to this year, when we would have a storm, especially hurricane or major storm stuff, we'd set up storm centers, and we'd be pulling large groups of folks together to have the war room mentality to coordinate our efforts, and that just couldn't be done this year. And so we quickly had to think about, first off, how many people could you safely get in a room to manage that face to face if we did. And actually, Ada was a good test for us, as I'm sure Jessica would say as well, where we actually did it all virtual. We didn't have storm rooms that folks set up in at all. In fact, we set up what I would call Teams virtual rooms, and we'd keep those rooms open all day. So the main storm center had one open, and the regional ones had one open. And if you needed to correspond, you would just jump into that meeting and have a virtual conversation with the folks that were in that room. And granted, it was a small storm, thank goodness, and didn't have great effects, but it did prove itself effective, at least on that small scale.
Not necessarily in my role. We've not really seen a huge impact. We've been continuing business as usual. If you have transformer related emergencies, alarms, equipment issues during and after hours, you still have to respond just like pre-pandemic working conditions. The only thing I will say it has impacted is we're limited on the number of individuals we're allowed on site at any point in time. So that, in some cases, depending on the emergency, that can be a hindrance when you need certain numbers of personnel to handle the issue, and you have to figure out ways to work, get the work done with less resources.
I'll speak specifically to storms. The answer is yes. Historically, when we ran our storm room, it was myself, substation supervisor, my peer, Jason, who is a line supervisor, Tim, who is area management, and a lot of support personnel. We had logistics folks that were responsible for entering Tom's data, which gives the ECC and our logistics folks real-time updates as far as restoration efforts. Also had veg management representation in the storm room with us, work management, oversight personnel, and we had a direct line of communication. We had those folks in that room with us, and it was really, really easy to not only make a plan for restoration, but to communicate it within a matter of seconds. So with the social distancing and limiting the number of employees in a storm room, getting that communication and getting that data out to who needed it was definitely impacted. It took a lot more work. We got through it. We got a dry run of it earlier this fall with a tropical depression, and I wouldn't say it was seamless, but we just planned for it. We knew what we had to do. We knew what we were not able to do anymore, and we were able to work through it.
Was there an impact to scheduling and executing work throughout the pandemic?
So impact, I would say, like we said earlier, we didn't miss a beat. I mean, yes, it was more difficult. And I think, the key is that communication is key here. And, prior to the pandemic, most of our scheduling meetings were kind of in that face-to-face setting. And now we were forced to try and do this via Teams. I mean, you weren't having those casual hallway conversations with folks where you could verify understanding with everybody and things like that. So it required, all those other forms of communications to work well, emails, Teams meetings, phone calls, even Maximo and the deliverables from that standpoint. So, I think what we learned was you can't assume that everyone's on the same page when you're forced to, really communicate like that. And you need to over communicate in order to validate that understanding. I kind of like to call it the double-barreled approach, where you need to use at least two forms of communication to make sure that we fully understand each other. And we stress this with our folks to make sure that they were doing that so that we wouldn't miss a beat when it came to that piece. And even on the execution side, and I'll let Jessica speak more to this as well, prior, work management spent a lot of time out in the fields, with the CNM folks, or just seeing what's going on so that we could validate schedules and where we were and things like that. And we kind of cut back on that, exposure as much as we possibly could. So, we had to rely on C&M to give us that information from the field. And at the end of the day, it still comes down to the same thing. We got to make sure that we're all communicating effectively. And that's what I saw happening. So.
Yeah, I think Troy, you brought up a lot of great points about that, and I completely agree that we did not miss a beat with scheduling and executing work. And I think work management definitely is the key. Was a key contributor to that success for our crews to be able to execute the work, in addition to the contract crews being able to execute the work. I think it became very evident that accuracy was critical, getting it right the first time. And to your point, over communicating, finding two means to just validate that the information is correct. One of the things that we did on the execution side, which seemed to work out very well, is we started a pilot using iPads and some new software, PlanGrid software. And historically, the in-house crews had never gotten prints electronically, and this was our first effort in doing that, and I think it worked very well. We took for granted that human element, that you could swing by and pick up prints, or somebody could stop by the field and drop them off. And so having that vehicle open up for us to be able to communicate directly with engineering, between the field and the engineer, was very helpful. And then also using the technology for walk downs prior to energizing the assets, again, was very helpful, just having that validation in place using technology. And I think the other key theme too was simplifying process. So, trying to execute as lean and as accurate as possible. There was not a lot of room for rework, or clearly precision was really important, is really important anyway, but especially, during this time, as we were transitioning to different work practices, since people began to work remotely, except for the field personnel.
Again, a lot of things changed the schedule, weather, equipment not being available, folks calling in sick. So it was really, really easy and really, really quick to make those schedule changes and adapt to the things that this line of business kind of throws at us. But again, using the technology, the Teams meetings, we've been able to get through that. We have a little bit different process now. We're getting the work done, we're getting the work scheduled, but how we do it has drastically changed over the last 10 to 12 months.